I call to order Lake Havasu City Council Budget Work Session on Tuesday, May 16th, 2017 at 9 a.m. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Would the city clerk please call the roll?
Council members Mark Nixon.
Here.
Donna McCoy. Jenny Koch. Here. Cal Sheehy.
Here.
Michelle Lynn. Here. David Lane.
Here.
Gordon Grove.
Here.
Okay, item 4 on our agenda is our call to the public. This is where our citizens have an opportunity to address the city council on any matters under the city's jurisdiction. If you do come up, please state your name, spell your last name for the benefit of the city clerk, and if you could, please keep your comments to 5 minutes or less. With that, would anybody like to address the council as part of call to the public? Seeing none, we're going to move on to item 5, continuation of budget discussion for fiscal year 2017-18. Is it going to be?
Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
Thank you. Welcome. Good morning. Welcome to the fourth in a series of budget work sessions. I'm including the retreat as the first, and there's only 2 more to go. So we're on the home stretch, and we're here to talk about some things we've already talked about budget-wise. So I'm going to hand it off to Tabitha and Cassandra.
Thank you. Good morning, Mayor, City Council. So we have sort of a hodgepodge of topics, and really what this session is always scheduled for is sort of the wrap-up. Kind of we bring back to council any information that you've requested, sort of additional thoughts and things to look at. So when we were putting this presentation together today, I can tell you it feels like it bounces around, but it's because we're really kind of tying up the last loose ends before we bring the budget back to you in June for approval of the tentative budget, and then at the end of June for approval of the final budget. So. Just a few items we're going to talk about today is we'll quickly go through a few changes to the budget that have already happened. We wanted to briefly just touch back on that idea of the banked property tax levy that we talked briefly about in the last session. Retaining residential trash billing, and that was something that Councilor Sheehy had asked us to look into. We open it up for a little bit more information on the grant agencies and some of the follow-up that was provided. The idea of potentially moving a contract for services for the Veterans Court piece of interagency, and then kind of a finalized bringing the full circle around to priority-based budgeting and give you an idea of how we've used that tool that we looked at the retreat back in January. With that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Cassandra to kind of walk you through a few of the adjustments we've made since the last time you saw the budget.
Okay, so this table shows the budget changes since the last budget work session. Items 1 through 3 are carry forwards. These are items that were budgeted in fiscal year 16-17, but we are now estimating they're going to be completed in 17-18. Item number 4, we added CIP bond proceeds. This is so we can continue to exclude the CIP from our expenditure limitation. Item 5 and 6 are CIP increases. Items 7 and 8 are PSPRS adjustments. This is due to updated information that we recently received from PSPRS. And item 9 is a refuse adjustment, which Tabitha will be going into more detail later on in the agenda. The total changes since the last budget work session is an increase of $18.5 million in revenues and a little over $4 million in expenditures.
On one of the requests we made was to go 8 to 5 Monday through Friday for transit or Havasu mobility. Is that factored in here anywhere?
It is, yes.
Okay, so it was just workable in the existing budget versus a change?
Yes, and at this point, that's how we were going to approach it.
Okay.
There is potential, and because that's quite honestly such a small dollar item, if in fact it impacts Havasu Mobility's budget, we can certainly figure out probably within the operating budget the way to keep that going into next year.
Perfect. Okay. And I'm sorry, but do you know when we would be able to implement that schedule?
Actually, Patrick's here and probably is the best one to answer that question.
Okay. because when people had asked me and I told them we were going to 8 to 5, of course, the first question was, when?
Good morning, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm looking at probably sometime in July, early August,
Okay,
only because of staffing right now. I
Sure.
just got to make sure we have enough backup, enough wiggle room to put it out. But
perfect.
its schedules are already out. I already have like 3 model schedules out, so I just won't wait till we get that back. But
Okay,
we'll
But
see.
you did have the senior bus on.
And the senior bus, we actually did start moving forward on that for Fridays.
okay.
So I started that last week. So I actually rode with the seniors that day, and we had like 14 of them dancing up and down in the bus, jumping up and down. So it was pretty funny. So
Looks like
they
we'll
were
need a
very
bigger
happy.
bus.
Yeah. That's right. So it was good. It was well received, and they're very
Perfect.
thankful for
Okay,
that
great.
opportunity.
Great. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Any other questions
questions on the changes?
adjustments? Like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about the trash one in a few minutes. So this is just, we talked about the potential or the banked property tax levy revenue that potentially was available. And again, we're not asking you to take any action on this at this point in time, but we want to make sure that council understands sort of how much money we're talking about. This simply graphs the amount, the green at the bottom is what the levy has been over the last 7 years, including, and then the potential for this next year. And as you can see, that drop between 2009, 10, and 10, 11 when we reduced it, and that it's pretty much been flat with a little bit of growth for new construction. Obviously, the blue at the top is what our potential levy could be if we maximized the legal capacity that the city has. To date, in the 2017-18 budget, actually ends up being $1,947,000 in change. So it's almost $2 million of additional revenue that's potentially available. And as you can see, it's just under $12 million if we had captured that over the full period of time. So it does have some capacity, and potentially, again, it may be something that we want to talk about in future meetings as far as pledging it to PSPRS or some other very specific use. So.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't think there's an appreciation, and that may be the wrong word to use, but I'll use it. I don't think there's an appreciation in the community of what taxes could have been versus what we decided to make them. Most other communities in Arizona are using the highest level of property taxes they're allowed, assuming they have a property tax, the highest level that is allowed by law. And yet, as Mr. Cassens and I heard just the other day when we were meeting with some other cities, they're still struggling to figure out how to balance their budget. So here we actually decided not to collect almost $12 million in taxes. We balance our budget and we build our reserves. So kudos to the council and the staff people out there for running a very tight ship.
And Mr. Mayor, we presented this graphic not to whine about how much money was left on the table or anything like that. It's just a good graphic illustration of exactly what the city did back in the depths of the Depression to help folks whose assessed values were going down at a time when many other communities were adopting that 2% and they're adding construction and trying to maximize whatever property tax they could get. At the same time, Lake Havasu City voted to hold the rate. The assessed values were down, so that's the little dip that you see off to the left there in the 2010-11. And then you've held the levy at that level, and as Tabitha said, the only adjustment has been for new construction. So, what was done appropriately, in my opinion, back in the recession to assist citizens with at least this small piece of their property tax bill, which is actually a very small component of your overall property tax. It does amount to money that can be put back to work in the community. We're at the tail end of the recession, and so maybe this is something that we look at coming out of the recession kind of in the same way that we went into it, and bring back that levy so that we can offset things like our PSPRS obligation and some other targeted things. We wouldn't propose to just put it back because we can. It would need to have a targeted purpose.
And I do remember the conversations during the Great Recession, because many people in the community would say, well, you need to run the city like a business. The problem with doing that is, in a business during the recession, the demand for their services goes down because nobody wants to spend any money, so you cut costs to meet that demand. In a municipality, the opposite is true. You have less revenue, but the demand for your service goes up because everybody is hurting. Notwithstanding, we still decided that, you know what, we're going to make do with what we got. It was painful at the time, but it's now amounted to almost $12 million that we chose not to collect from the community.
It's almost like a miniature version of a self-imposed expenditure limitation.
It was, exactly right.
So moving on to the whole issue of residential trash, I know this is a lot of numbers, but we put it up here, and it happens to be the Refuse Enterprise Fund, which is where we account for the residential trash fees. And what we wanted to do is sort of plug it in so that we could look at it not just for this year, but sort of on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to kind of point you to the middle column, which is our proposed budget. You'll notice that we have increased, if you looked at the sheet that was included in your original documents, we've increased the residential trash fees revenue, and we've also increased the operation and maintenance, which is that offset, because basically what will happen if we take it on currently at the current rate that Republic would be is charging their customers less the dollar fee, we would basically bring in the same amount of revenue that we would be turning around and paying back out to Republic. So there is a little bit of an impact there in that, and you can see the difference between 17-18 and 18-19 in that interest and miscellaneous. That interest and miscellaneous also includes some of the fees for a partial year in 17-18 that we get from Republic currently for doing the billing. We get some administrative fees. There's some additional fees that are added to the trash service that if we do a straight pass-through of what Republic charges us to our customers and collect that, we would be sort of eliminating those fees from the cost. And that's sort of that cost of that dollar that Republic's willing to give us a credit on per account per month because of those additional fees. What I would point out, and you can also see it sort of in the bottom, the current year resources, the bottom line, you can see that dip that happens because of it. Part of those fees we have always intended when we redo the landfill contract that we would incorporate and increase those fees there to recoup those. And that's really strategic in that we're focusing on, everything we're doing right now is focusing on the landfill, the life of the landfill, and the potential liability and cost to close it and possibly open another. And so we feel like the fees should be collected there, and they really should be reserved for whatever those liabilities are, so that we plan for the future. But there is a little bit of dip if we take the billing on. It's kind of a pass-through, so you can see that our resources drop a little bit. But again, we're providing the service to our customers of providing that billing, tying it again back to their water bill, so we have an easy enforcement mechanism for non-payment, and it also helps keep it sound. But in the bottom, we really can afford to do that, and you can see that we do go a little bit negative in 17-18. But one of the big reasons for that is that we are taking some of the reserves. We've allocated some of the ongoing reserves to our CIP projects, and specifically in 17-18 is the Havasu 280, some of the infrastructure cost out at that project. So it's good, it's fine. We will fix the $48,000 negative, but we didn't want to hide that from council when we plug the numbers back in.
Well, and if you don't use your contingency that year, it becomes positive.
Exactly. And keep in mind, we've excluded from this whole model, we have about $3.1 million set aside already for closure of the landfill. We put about $125,000 a year into that. That's not included anywhere here because, quite frankly, we didn't want to show it as an available resource because we didn't want to give anybody the idea that it was available. So that is already separate and accounted for. Any questions?
Mr. Mayor? Yes. Why would you use this fund for the 280 infrastructure? How does that work?
It was identified because part of the funding that we have gotten over the years on the residential trash is a beautification fund. Those are the funds that we're sort of allocating back to that project. So they've built up over time, and those are the funds that were available and we felt like were appropriate, especially for the city's piece of that project. So really the bigger issue wasn't the fund and how it would impact that, but how it would impact the expenditure limitation assumptions. So we've talked quite a bit about this already starting at the retreat, but kind of the two things that we will do next year to manage the expenditure limitation, they're both issuing debt, but they're for two separate purposes. The first we've talked about, which is to issue the debt to cover the PSPRS employer contributions both for 17-18 and 18-19. We do have to do that as taxable, so the interest rate's going to be a little bit higher. But our plan is to pay it off within a couple years too, so that it would be a short-term just turnaround. We can avoid carrying, for expenditure limitation purposes, the $6 million plus in each year of that expense. So that really helps us kind of buy down that number. The additional thing we would do is that once we have used up the current debt proceeds of the 2016, and we estimate we'll have at least $6 million of that rolling into next year, we, as Cassandra showed you, we have $16 million, which is the max that we would issue of additional CIP debt budgeted for sometime next year when we get to that point and we need those funds. So between those two, we've built in enough capacity to our expenditure limitation to accommodate the additional increase or the ongoing increase, at least for the next 2 years, for residential trash. I have already talked to Republic and told them, though, that we want to keep that option in our contract so that at any point we need to use that as an out, we can turn the billing and all of the financial piece back over to them. This is just a recap on kind of the graph we showed you back at the retreat. And of course the ugly drop, and this was based on sort of where we were projected, not taking into account what we just talked about as far as just trying to, if we didn't do anything to manage the expenditure limitation, we basically would go negative next year in our carry forward. And this is the numbers plugged in based on those assumptions that I just talked about. So really what happens here is that we end up just under $2 million still available in our carry forward at the end of 2019. And we actually add a little bit between the end of this year and next year because of some of those changes in the 12 million plus whatever we need to avoid for the CIP. So it looks like at this point we can make that work. And we're kind of shifting, again, this ad hoc today, shifting to whether or not the council wanted to take an opportunity to discuss any of the follow-up on the grant agencies. And I'll turn that over to you.
If we could just go back to trash service, and this is just more for information for council because it was news to me, and maybe it was only news to me, but I thought the new service was going to take place July 1, when in fact it's going to take place January 1. So I don't know if anybody else knew that or not.
I believe that's due to the lead time on the equipment.
Correct. But I think it was even printed in the, because I started getting emails and that it was, you know, how are you going to do this with all the winter visitors gone, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And long story short, it isn't going to take place till January 1.
Right, and even that, I will then go out on a limb and say even that it has to be a flexible date because yes, we will have a new contract in place on July 1, but everything's not going to just be turned on and changed on July 1. You know, Republic is
Republic's telling me actually their contract will start on January 1.
That's because of the amendment that we extended it by 6 months.
I beg your pardon. I forgot about the amendment.
Yeah, so that's why they're telling. Yeah, there is lead time, but they're also saying that we're going to stay with our original contract for an additional 6 months. So
Got it.
That was
My apologies. I forgot about the
That's all right.
amendment that we did.
I wasn't, I just wanted to make sure other council members were aware, because I certainly was under the wrong impression. Nobody's fault but my own. Okay, grant agencies. If I could start, and then I know council members will have other comments. I asked the courts to do an analysis for me of the counseling services that we provide for non-combat veterans through interagency, because we give them $50,000 a year to provide those services, along with some other things, rent assistance, utility assistance, I believe, etc. Make a long story short, I was dismayed to see that they had not counseled a single veteran. Unless, and I don't see interagency here today, but unless they can show that our information is just incorrect, I would strongly suggest that we drop 50 grand from the contract. And that next year we also insist that they provide veteran counseling services for no additional cost. Because I think, based on what I've seen, and they had in some stats that food bank, but we're already paying for food banks, so that doesn't count. So long story short, I want the taxpayers $50,000 worth of services that we asked for, and so I think there's one of three options. Well, certainly drop the 50 grand from the contract this year. Number two, either provide services next year at no additional cost, and we need to be able to insist on it. And if that's not available to us, then I believe a check should be written back to the taxpayers for 50 grand.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
If you recall in review, several years ago, the $50,000 was at the last minute put into the budget.
Correct.
As a grant, because it was in anticipation of award of a SAMHSA grant.
Correct.
And apparently, while the grant has been applied for each subsequent year, we've not been successful in acquiring that grant. So it's kind of morphed into just being in the grant package for interagency, and certainly I believe it would be appropriate because for pulling out as a separate contract for service, because it is something that can be tracked, can be invoiced. We can pay for it on a kind of an as-you-go type of basis, and budget for those services, and then pay under a contract. And in fact, I would suggest and recommend, and you've heard me say this before, I know, Mayor, that it would be my opinion that the city actually get out of the grant business. It is really not what the city was created for. I am not aware, I could be wrong, but I'm not aware of many other communities in Arizona anyway that are in the grant award business. We're here to provide essential public services, and if we are awarding grants for what would otherwise be considered essential public services, then those are ripe for contract. We should contract for those services and pay for them as as they are provided. It brings a higher level of accountability for how we spend the taxpayers' money, and gets us out of the grant business. And I would propose that we inform those grant agencies that are used to getting grants from the city that at the end of this biennial budget cycle that we're not going to be issuing any grants, but if there are services that the city needs, we can contract for those separately.
And I would probably go one step further and say that I think this should be the last year, not second to last year, but based on what I'm seeing, I'd prefer that the next budget year we just say, you know what, it's going to be RFPs, grants only, or excuse me, contracts only, because and part of it is just because of what we're seeing, what I'm seeing today, but also the pushback that we got on trying to help some agencies and the fighting amongst nonprofit groups.
That was disappointing.
I was very disappointed. I was incredibly disappointed. So, and I've had too many taxpayers say, you know what, if I want to make a donation, I'll make a donation, but I don't want you making a donation with my tax dollars. Because in some cases, we're donating to agencies that somebody else might not agree with. So I tend to agree with you. I think we've whittled this down from, I think, about 375,000 years ago down to where we're at today. But I think, and we have asked every agency to wean off of taxpayer dollars. Most of them have done it. But I think it's time, I think it would be inappropriate to say this year, forget it, we're changing our mind because it's so late in the process. But I think this should be the last year. But that's up to the
If that's a consensus of council, then we can make that happen.
Mr. Mayor, so we would issue an RFP, and then Haven and Search and Rescue would come back with what they could provide. Because I mean, those are very essential to our community. So we have to.
I agree.
Okay.
And because they're specialized services for Haven, we don't enter into an RFP. They are the only providers within the area that provide that service, so we enter into a direct selection agreement with Haven because of those services. So in analyzing any of the other services, it would go through whatever appropriate method it would have to go through.
So how would that work with Search and Rescue, where it's mostly volunteer based, but it provides such an essential service to us?
We could do it through the fire department, probably.
I don't know exactly how we would make that happen or how we would pay for those services, but I mean, we'll determine that and figure out the best way to handle
Well,
it.
an investment of $2,600 is like the return we get. Like we can't have them jump through all these hoops as volunteers.
That's a good example of, a contract that we could have with, we have, if you recall, they originally asked for $2,480. We got the 480 off because we entered into a mutual aid agreement with them. We could also have a readiness contract or something to that effect, wherein they would just bill us for the service and we would pay them. And there may be other things like the interagency there. If there is counseling that's included in there, we would consider an essential public service. Then we can consider that for an RFP. As part of the contention that we've had in this last go round with the grants, as you recall, is that now there are multiple providers in town. So that's when it's appropriate to do an RFP, when you have multiple providers. Then you can set the scope of work and you know exactly what it is you're negotiating with and what it's going to cost, and then you end up with a contract. And then there's performance measures involved in that too. So if they're not fulfilling the need, then we either get somebody else or we just don't provide that service anymore.
Yeah, and this isn't to say that the nonprofit agencies that made presentation or any other nonprofit agency, qualified nonprofit agency, isn't doing good work for the community. But I think we're at a point that it shouldn't be taxpayer funded, it should be individual contributions. That's how nonprofits are supposed to work in the beginning, unless there is a contract for service. I mean, there are government contracts with nonprofit agencies. A good example is the Humane Society. They do our boarding. If we didn't have a contract with them to do boarding, we'd be boarding them ourselves because the community says, you need to board these animals. So we contract with a nonprofit to make that happen. So I think that's a perfect situation of how it should work in the future. But again, we need to get some consensus from council, not just me pontificating.
Well, I think it gives us better control over our dollar instead of just giving money to an agency and saying, okay, this is what we expect you to do, and then there's no controls over how that money's spent. It's silly in my book. This way here, by not just giving them the money, but doing an RFP for essential services. We can pick and choose what services truly are essential that the government should be assisting with and which are not. And we'll probably end up saving money in the long run.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that that's the most prudent way to go. One step further for this year with interagency, can we put the 125,000 in a budget, but go out for an RFP with them right now for the additional services that they offer and have a competitive bidding process for that? I mean, the 125 stays, and then you guys go through a normal RFP process, and you guys decide what needs to happen.
What I'm hearing from council right now is that this will be the last year of the grant proceeds, and the interagency will get the 125. The 50 will be under a separate contract. We're going to pull that out. So that will be our kind of our first foray into carving out specific services under contract. And then before this time next year, when we're going through the budget process, we can solicit RFPs for those services that we'll have to talk with you about what services we might be giving grant funds for now that you do want to solicit contracts for.
But is it too late to have that 125 go through that process this year?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think staff is prepared, frankly, to analyze what those services might be and determine whether or not they fall under a service that we may want to do that for.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to have this budget in bed here in a few weeks, so there's just not time for it.
It is disappointing, though, the way the information flowed to us and the lack of information we have on it to be able to allocate that kind of money that way. So.
Well, yeah, I don't disagree. We do know they're providing essential services to the community, whether it be food bank, rent assistance, utility assistance, blah, blah, blah. But I agree with Mr. Lane that more accountability is appropriate. And you mentioned something about pulling out the 50 grand. To be clear, I don't want to issue a contract for an additional 50 grand this year. It's zero because we didn't get what we paid for it last year. So our contract with them this year is either give us a check for 50 grand or provide one additional year of service of veteran counseling for nothing.
Because we didn't get it last year.
Got it. I mean, may sound harsh, but that's a reality of not getting what we paid for. And so that would be my suggestion, but again, I'm just 1 out of 7.
And a prime example of why we should be moving in the direction that we're talking about.
Exactly.
So for this year, we get the quarterly reports from these agencies that we fund. What goals do we set for interagency? How can that look for this next year then? Because we read them and it looks like they're doing good work. So I just don't, the perception might be that we kind of overlook this, but we read through that each quarter.
Well, and I'd like to go back a little bit about why certain things got allocated the way they did to interagency. To some degree it was for services, but I recall going way back is that what we did was they could use the city funding for leveraging grants, because many of the grants they got were not allowed to have admin services as part of that grant. So they could, but if they had another way to pay for it, i.e. the city, then they were able to get additional grants, then provide more services than they otherwise could have. So that's how that kind of got done. But we kept saying, but we're whittling you down, because I forgot what we used to pay interagency. It was $250 or more, but a lot of it was for exactly that. Because they would go out for a grant, and if they put in admin, they weren't allowed to have the grant. But if they could say, well, the admin will be paid for by this portion of Lake Havasu City, then they could get a $300,000 grant. So it was good leverage on their part. But I think at this point, since we've asked them now for, I can't tell you how many years, not just them, but all agencies, it's time that you move away from that dependence. So it's going to be tough to get what you might call I mean, I think we should still get, how many people do you serve at the food bank, rent assistance, utility assistance? You might even say, okay, well, what grants did you get using the city funding that got you additional funding? Because those are certainly paybacks on taxpayer dollars, because if you put in 50 and you get a grant for 400, that's a nice little pop, but I'll leave that up to the finance department to figure out how best to.
So you're looking for additional detail or greater detail on exactly how the city funding was allocated or used?
Yeah, I'd like it to be a little more specific than what we got. I didn't.
Well, that tends to be what we get, is basically just a financial report, and it really doesn't, it doesn't carve out the city's piece.
And I get why that's hard.
Oh, yeah.
Because you take the 125 and you put it into their, we'll call it the general fund
Yeah, it
account
goes
for
into the
now.
mix, yeah.
And it goes in the mix, and it's hard to say, well, I used that specific dollar for this. But if they were able to say, well, here's grants we applied for, and we were able to say that $35,000 of the city funding was what we used to leverage for that grant, then I'm good with that, because that works. And again, I think we should get the usual things about. I know that the food bank there's a ton of people that go through that, but. So anyway, some kind of detail on that, of showing how that 125 got leveraged appropriately.
And I can tell you, I've looked through the contracts and what we require, and they are meeting what we've asked them to meet as far as their quarterly financials. We just didn't put enough detail in there to get more information. And so that is something we can certainly do if council goes in that direction this next year.
Right. And I'm not trying to beat up on interagency or any other nonprofit organization. What I'm really trying to do is make sure taxpayers get what they paid for. That's it, no matter who that is. So,
Mr. Mayor?
yes.
If I may offer an observation, having run a nonprofit, that they are supposed to be able to stand on their own with contributions from the community and their own business model. There are sometimes the need for matching funds or partnership allocation funds. In other words, if you give us a grant for $100,000, we need to have X amount of dollars. We may be able to establish some kind of a mechanism or a fund that we would be able to respond to that if something like that has to happen within a fiscal year, so that we don't rule that possibility out altogether to get a bigger bang for our buck. But in general, what I'm hearing is very logical. We do need to have greater transparency and accountability. So I agree with the mayor on that piece.
Yeah, that's actually not a bad idea, where you put so much away. When we'd have to see how that would work, but we would only write that check assuming they were successful on the
Right.
grant.
Right.
Just applying won't get you there. Because you're right, if 25 leverages you to 300, that's a pretty good return.
Yeah, and I know that that's something that would be new for our municipality. I'm just asking if maybe we could explore and see what other municipalities have done that have been successful in that regards.
Mr. Mayor, yeah, I wouldn't be a fan of that. We still have to remember that these are essential services that the government needs to provide. So we don't really need to be in the business of helping nonprofits leverage dollars, in my opinion. I mean, that's, we need to find another mechanism.
Yeah, I mean, because to some degree it could get out of control. I guess we just have to see.
Yeah.
We'd have to explore pluses and
Thank you,
minuses of
because,
that one.
the more I think about it, the more scared I get.
Yeah, initially it sounds like the right thing to do, but I could see a lot of agencies then coming to us and saying, well, we're going to leverage this.
If you do it for one, you have to do it for all of them.
Yeah,
But
let's at least look at it to see if it could function, and if it can't, well, it can't.
And just,
agreed.
For, the reminder that the, health and human services is actually a county function. So, how much of that is going on that the city is issuing grant monies for, that, takes the county off the hook for that. So, I'm not sure, where I'm going with that, but, maybe there's an obligation or a responsibility that the county participate more in these things, if in fact we deem it to be an essential public service. Frankly, it's the county that is charged with providing that kind of service.
Well, we for years picked up half of the utility costs of running the senior center because the county couldn't afford to do so. Now, to the credit of the senior center, when we asked that they wean themselves off of that, they did. They found a way to make it work. So it's time all the other agencies did the same.
So is there a consensus on council that this be the last year that the city issue grants? Head nods? Yes?
For me, yes, I think we need better accountability. We need to make sure we have the essential services, but better accountability and not just giving different agencies money and assuming that they're doing what they're doing, because we're not getting that line item on exactly what they're doing, and paying $50,000 for counseling for veterans and then not getting any counseling is a total waste of money. Veterans Court could use that money a lot better.
Mayor,
Yes.
I guess there's no counseling services provided for Veterans Court. Do we know why? Do we know what the disconnect was? I mean, were they asked for those services and then declined the services, never asked for the services, never, I mean, there's got to be a reason.
I can't answer the question.
If you like. I believe that those counseling services are what was deemed to be necessary for those veterans that may not be eligible for VA benefits.
Correct.
So Veterans Court made the decision to accept all veterans, whether they're active or discharged or whatever their status, their discharge status might be. Veterans Court is still available to them, but a total VA package might not be available to them. So we wanted to provide the same services for those non-VA eligible veterans than for the ones that are VA eligible, and that's what this was intended to do.
But I can't. I don't.
We just have no idea why the services weren't provided.
I can't answer your question. I know we do counseling for non-combat veterans, but for some reason it shows that interagency didn't participate. I don't know the answer. So that's why I want next year for them to participate at no additional cost.
Okay, I think we have everything we need on that.
But did we get consensus on the 50 grand? Because
Well, from what I heard was that we're just going to pull the 50 grand out interagency.
But I wanted to make sure people agreed and it wasn't just me
We'll get the
talking.
125, and this will be the last year of that.
I agree.
Everyone else?
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
I have a hard time giving interagency any money at this time. They didn't provide two of the items that we asked for. Pulling the 50, I mean, I'm very happy with that because they weren't held accountable. I understand that they provide other services. We do have other agencies in town that provide those same services. And if they're not being transparent with the counseling for the veterans, how much more are they? We asked for certain line items. We didn't get line items. That's my opinion. I understand the whole council, but that's my opinion.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I agree with pulling the 50. I am concerned with the 125 as well, just because of the information. So whatever we can do to put additional reporting. So when we get our quarterly reports, even if we can't say the 125 specifically did something, but how many total people did they assist? How many total people through the food bank? How many total people through the domestic violence shelter? How many total people? That would allow me to be able to talk to taxpayers and show the investment in the social service agency that the city made. If we could make that happen.
Okay. Go
I
ahead.
mean, we can certainly add and be very specific about what services we're funding. That's the other piece, is that, the other option is to, instead of giving administrative dollars, we say we're giving this for X program and we expect for you to show us how you're spending, whether it be the food bank or other counseling services, but we can be very specific, which is what a lot of granting agencies do, is they give for a particular purpose or a particular expense. And that's another way to make it accountable and get specific reporting on that piece.
Unfortunately, I think it's too late for them in this year. I mean, it's a large size of money, and for us to restrict at this level when they've had the past experience of us not being that way, I don't know
Well,
if we can
except
do it
she
for this
said
year.
that they actually met the terms of their contract.
Of our current agreement.
Of our
yeah.
current agreement, yes.
Right.
The difference would be we would change in the new agreement that if council chose to give the 125, that we would be very specific about how it be spent and how it be accounted for. And that certainly, if they agree to take the money, they agree to provide those terms.
And maybe to Councilmember Lynn's concerns and comments, I think maybe what you do is you make it that they've got to meet whatever requirements on a quarterly basis, or they don't get the next installment.
And that is how on many of the grant agencies, just to get the reporting on a quarterly basis, we had to tie it to their next payment. So that's not abnormal.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Maybe one thing that will help would be, instead of asking them for the information and then just getting kind of a hodgepodge of financial reports and stuff that, we would have to weed through to try and figure out where the city's money went, we could put together a questionnaire or a form, just have them fill out a form that's very specific, pointed questions, and then each of them will be consistent, and we'll craft it in a way that that gives you a clear indication as to exactly what those funds are going towards.
Okay.
We can put that together.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes.
can I ask Tabitha a question?
Sure.
Tabitha, you provided me some information from interagency that gave us a total of their grants, contracts, and donations. And so, I don't know if everybody on council got this.
Everybody got those,
okay.
yes.
Interagency isn't just receiving $125,000 from Lake Havasu. They have $1.7 million in cash they're receiving. And when you go through their budgets and they have their goals, it doesn't ever say if they reach them, if it was really spent, and I think that's what I'm missing, that information. And just on record, this isn't the first time I've asked for this. It's been 2 years that I've been asking for this information.
I'm not sure what the question was. I would expect that they would get other grants, contracts, and donations other than what we're providing. Otherwise, we wouldn't have provided anything.
I guess I'm just saying that Councilmember Sheeny had mentioned that they provide all these services. They do, but they're getting other money. It's not just from the city that they're receiving money. They're receiving quite a bit, 1.7 plus. That doesn't even include the food bank contributions.
Right. Food bank contributions are not cash contributions.
No, I understand. Well, there's
Yeah.
2 on there. I think that
They're in kind.
there were 2 on there.
But
There was food bank, $75,000 in donations cash, and then
Correct.
1.6, almost
right.
7 in kind. So
Right.
they do receive quite a bit for food bank.
Yeah, agreed.
Mr. Mayor. Yeah, my point, Councilmember Lynn, is that the 125 these are some services that the city would have to provide otherwise. So if they weren't, that's where our contribution is that if we had somebody that needed domestic violence services, the city somehow would have to have some sort of provider to take care of that or do it in-house.
Councilmember Sheeny, do you think that's the only agency that offers those services?
No, I know it's not, but that's who the grant is with right now.
Yeah, and
That's
I
the
get, and
conversation.
I'm understanding what you're saying. So I would just like to see a more detailed of where it's going.
Agreed. I agree with you. I think I've heard that from the entire council today.
Mayor,
Yes.
I want to make just a quick point. We, over the years, have been carving out what services are in contrast to what a grant is. And so what we have today is we've carved out what we believe are truly essential services that are necessary for the city to do its job. And what's left are what you have now before you in the grant agreement. So I don't know that all of the services that are being provided that we pay the money for the grants are essential services to the city, that we are required by some sort of law or contract or rule to provide. So that's part of the analysis that we would have to do more in depth with interagency, is to determine what of those services are truly, if any, are essential services that the city would actually have to provide, or decide that they are going to provide those in the case that nobody else can provide them within the city, or that we're even going to pay somebody else to provide them, what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. At this time, what we're paying interagency for hasn't been deemed as an essential service.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and that's where there will be some heartburn from some of the nonprofits next year. I think search and rescue is certainly essential. Some of the services that Haven does with the police department are definitely essential, but then somebody could argue that childhood meals on weekends is not to be provided. So there's going to be heartburn no matter what we do. I get all that, and while food banks are essential services, I don't know how many cities are really funding those. I could be wrong, but
Just be ready for the fallout. There will be fallout from this. But
and
I
I
think
know,
it's-
and I get it, but because nobody was weaning themselves off over the years, I think sometimes you got to just put your foot down and say, okay, we're done.
Oh, Kelly's right. I think what we'll do at staff level is we'll look at what the total package of each of these grants has been in the past, and carve out those things that the city could potentially be expected to provide if nobody else were doing it. I mean, like a domestic abuse hotline or something like that. And then those things we can pull out and we can do an RFP. So if there are multiple agencies that either do that or are willing to do that, then we can hear from them. So in the end, we will end up with a more accountability and hopefully better service to the community.
Okay.
Tabitha, have everything you need?
I think so, yes, thank you.
Good.
So I'm just going to skip the next slide because we've sort of dealt with that already.
Okay.
And move on to kind of a wrap up with priority-based budgeting. And it's sort of interesting, the conversation that we just had as far as priority-based budgeting, because this is sort of the principles, sort of the reasons why we would go through that exercise. And a lot of it is looking at what the city's priorities are, what the city really should be funding, being accountable, trying to figure out the true cost of doing business. But it's really looking at value with, when we're spending our taxpayer dollars. And these happen to be, the first 5 are community results that the council developed and staff refined, and the 6th one is really about how we govern ourselves, how we operate as a city. But these are sort of the community priorities that we established. And if you look through them, they're pretty basic and they're pretty broad in the sense that they apply to almost everybody who lives in the city, works in the city, or even visits the city. We want to feel safe. We want sustainable growth and development. We want reliable infrastructure. We want a clean environment. And then overall, we just want a good place to live, work, and play. And we want our government to be accountable and responsible. And so keep these in mind kind of as we walk through this process, because this is what we based the process on, was how they rate against these things here. Kind of another piece of the puzzle is looking at when we went through and identified as departments what we did, what programs and services we provided. We also looked at sort of the basic program attributes. And the first one is really applicable today, which is whether or not the city has a legal requirement to provide that service. Trying to get back to basics again, which is let's do what we do and let's do it well. The second one is reliance on the city to provide the service. That's the idea of that maybe we aren't necessarily the right organization. If somebody else is doing that service or can provide that service, they may be able to do it better, and we need to look at that. Demand is simply whether or not the need for that service is increasing or decreasing. Cost is whether or not we receive revenues that offset part of the cost, and in some cases, the entire cost of the program. And then the last one is really important when we kind of look at where we ended up, which is how many people in the community are served by the program. And we have a lot of programs that are very important, but it's a small number of people who benefit from them. This is the graph that you saw back in January. And you can see that for the most part, anything in quartile 1 or 2, we felt like when we evaluated, scored those particular programs or services, they met those results and those basic attributes, that they were important and they provided good value for the city. Stuff in quartile 3 is sort of stuff that we wanted to take a look at as departments, make sure that they really were being done well, maybe looking at how much we were spending and if there was a different way to do it, but they're still important services to the city. Quartile 4, which is the $4.4 million, and I'll tell you that's a little bit less because we've gone through and really evaluated that the quartile 4 are those services that I certainly would not tell you are not important because they're very important, and particularly services that are provided to a smaller portion of the community. They may be vital to those people who they are served. But when you compared them to those community results and you looked at whether the city was mandated to provide that service or the true value or the demand, they didn't necessarily rate. And that quartile 4 is really where, as departments, we've tried to spend the last few months evaluating what we do and whether or not we're doing it right, we're spending the right amount of money on it. And in some cases, quartile 4 we found were things that were mandated, but didn't necessarily add value to the community at the level that we would have liked. So you have a list in front of you because this is impossible to read and it's 2 pages long, but we gave you a list of what ended up kind of falling in that quartile 4 amount, and it's all the programs. It's actually, you'll see that it's sorted by department, and there is a real trend if you go through and look at what's here, and I know that all of the departments have gone through these in a lot of detail, is again, it really kind of focuses on things that provide service to a small group, or in some cases, and my department happens to be the first one listed, it's things that when you look at it by standing by itself, you're like, well, you're right, it doesn't really add community value. We may find it important, and in some cases even a required service, but it's maybe not something that when you rate it against those other community values is as high as we would like it to be. Each department over the last few months has gone through this list. They also looked at their quartile 3, and really the idea behind this was to take a look at what we do, take a look at what it cost, and then in most cases it was about whether or not in those costs we should reallocate resources. And in some cases, and I can tell you, HR risk had a great example of whether or not it should be done by somebody else. They actually outsourced their workers' comp first response, the triage now. I think you probably all got the cards and saw the posters. They looked at the cost of what they were spending to administer and said, we can find somebody else that can do it cheaper and probably better. In some cases, it can be done cheaper. One of the things that this process did is that we allocated staff time to each program. And in many cases, when we started looking at what it was costing, we found that maybe the staff person who was doing the task that was in a quartile 4 item was a higher paid staff person. And it's like, okay, if that service isn't a priority, maybe we need to make it cost less. And so we used different people to do it. And in other cases, it was, should it be done at all? And I'll give you an example in my department, which is every other year, you probably receive the really gigantic budget book. It's about 400 pages. There are probably, I would say, maybe half a dozen people who actually read it, and probably, if we're honest, not everybody at this table. The whole thing, the whole 400 pages, but we found that the cost of that was almost $25,000, and most of it was staff time. And we thought, this is crazy. We can put together probably a smaller, more condensed book that more people will read and will be more useful and not spend that staff time on that particular item. And so that's something where we will still produce a budget book. It just won't be 400 pages. So I am sorry to anybody who enjoyed that read, but you're going to have to read the abbreviated version this next year.
How am I going to fall asleep at night?
If you haven't gone through the past ones, I have a whole library for you, so you'll be okay.
I was going to say, I have read it, and I would like to be able to come in and sit and read it there at the office, if that's okay.
I'll set up a little, like a big chair in the corner, and I'll stack that and our annual financial statements, because they're also a very good read.
Absolutely, thank you.
But it really was a good opportunity for us as staff. One of the things that was more of a difficult situation for the recreation program was taking a look at teen break, and this kind of clarified some of those costs. We were able to put dollars to it, and again, evaluate whether the city was the right organization to provide that service. So I want to point out, this is not a list of services that are not important and not valued. It's just those things that maybe didn't meet the level of community-wide support that they need. And this is also sort of an introduction to sort of where we go with this priority-based budget going forward. We'd like to continue it. We think it's probably something that we can continue to refine. We've uploaded all of the new budget numbers for 17-18 into the spreadsheet. I don't have them for you because we need to do some massaging and some work, but we'd like to bring that back and continue to evaluate what we do and look at those priorities, and also make sure that that's really where the city stands. And that might include some outreach to our citizenry and getting some more input from those folks on what's important in their city. And with that, I am done, but I will answer questions.
Mr. Mayor, just to tag on to what Tabitha was saying about priority-based budgeting, you'll recall that back in 2010, we had some tough decisions to make as an organization. Mm-hmm. And staff and I sat around the conference table in my office, and we essentially, recrafted the organization from the ground up. And we used a system, a grassroots system, very similar to the priority-based budgeting model and methodology, basically looking at all of the functions that we did as an organization, the value that those functions, or in priority-based budgeting, they call them programs. And so we did it on a fast track, but it very closely resembled the priority-based budgeting model. And priority-based budgeting is relatively new, and you heard me talking about it first a couple of years ago. And it sparked my interest because what I learned about priority-based budgeting so closely modeled what it is we had done in 2010 that I thought it would be a good measurement tool to determine how good of a job we did back in 2010. And so the fact that we have so many valuable programs listed on the quartile 4 list, which technically should be the throwaway stuff. We're not throwing this stuff away because it has great value, but the fact that these valuable programs still showed up on the quartile 4 tells me it verifies that in fact we did a good job back in 2010 on carving out the non-essential stuff that we were doing, that we identified back then, and we eliminated. So again, frankly, I'm pleased with the result of this exercise because, again, it just tells me that in fact what we have been doing was the right thing to do for the organization.
So what is the plan for this list exactly?
So what staff has done is they've had this list plus the quartile 3 and have gone through and looked at changes. And so some of those will be reflected in the new budget numbers, and in when we reallocate cost, you may see some of these go down. Some of them, a few of them probably will be eliminated. A lot of them we went through the process of saying, at this point we can afford Channel 4. It's not something that we feel like we need to cut out. It's still important to our community, even if it may not rise to that level. but continuing to evaluate what we're doing with those programs and making sure that they are maybe better serving our community or they're serving the community at a lesser price. But there are a lot of things on here that I don't anticipate when we look at them, reducing them or removing them from the list. And I think something that was a little surprising to me, if you remember from the retreat in January, when we had Chris on the phone and he was walking through an example, he showed us Boulder, Colorado, who's been doing this. They were one of the cutting edge communities. I think they've been doing this for almost 10 years now. And they had only moved maybe $1 million from their quartile 4 up into quartile 3 in a 10-year period. And it's a lot of these smaller programs that impact a few people, and they've made conscious choices in some case to keep them around. They may be mandated, it may be just, it's something that the community can afford and values, but it's more the idea of continually looking at these and figuring out how to reduce from, the 4.4 that was originally on screen. The numbers here are about 3.3 million, but to continue to reduce those items and that spending that isn't adding as much value as we'd like. But we also want to make sure that council and the community are included in that process.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Yeah, so how are some of these numbers determined? Because some of these costs are a little bit out of line, like if you just look at it in an overview.
So yeah, and so the cost is we had every department go through, identify the programs. The next step was we took each line item for their department, and it is departmentalized, and I will tell you there's a little bit of, it gets a little bit tricky because some programs actually cross departments, and it's not a great measurement there. But they went through and allocated line by line how much was spent on each, and in some cases we called it what we would say overhead, which is that it couldn't really, a particular line item could not be associated with a particular program, so we just allocated it based on sort of the total cost. The next step was taking every staff member in that department, and we did the same thing, which is allocate in increments of at least 5%, because we didn't want to get too down into the details where they were spending their time. And so the total cost of the employee, so the employee cost plus benefits, was also allocated out. And so that's sort of where these came, and that is the lump of it. The piece that's not on this particular sheet that's also interesting is where, in some cases, where there's program revenue that offsets it. And that also is taken into consideration on some of these programs.
So in this process, is it 100% you have to get to? So if there's like one employee, you need to, through this process, get 100% of them somewhere?
Yes. Yeah. And it's actually, there's a spreadsheet and it turns green. It's red until you get 100% of their time allocated. And the same thing with every line item. There is certain line items that we kind of, again, throw in that overhead because they just don't apply to a specific program.
And so then just to clarify, because again, there are a lot of great programs on here. How is that conversation going to happen with all of us to make sure that they don't just disappear? Because, Team Break's actually not even on here.
No. First of all, we're not, it's before you so you can see where we're at. I don't think at this point any of these programs are on the chopping block, and we certainly would come back to council, especially some of those that are more particular as far as having council involvement or council interest. It's an ongoing process, and again, I don't see us getting rid of this list altogether, but I do see us working it over the year. But that would definitely come back to you. We're not secretly chipping away at them.
Mr. Mayor, yeah, it would be impossible to get to a zero number of programs in quartile 4, and we wouldn't propose to do that. I wanted to thank Tabitha and her team for taking on this project, and we did all take it seriously. I think the data is good. We will be using it on an ongoing basis, and we will be refining it and referring to it. And anyway, I want to thank Tabitha for taking it on and making it a priority.
If I may, I also want to congratulate Tabitha and staff for putting together great priority-based budgeting. This is a very interesting sheet to look at. And Councilor Shee's right, there's a lot of very important projects on here. I think it'd be neat, to see the entire spreadsheet sometime so we can see the 1s, 2s, and 3s as well.
Absolutely. I'm more than willing to download that, and I can even email it out if that's what you'd all like.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Sure.
Mr. Mayor, I have a couple of points off of priority-based budgeting, but I just want to clarify from conversations from our last meeting to now. There is some conversation about team break, and just for the public, I think that it's important that we're talking about the city not having the direct involvement with team break, but it would be a community event, so it still would happen. But the city would be offering now the normal after-school program during spring break period. So I think that's important for the community. Some folks are thinking that we're not supporting team break, but I believe from the conversations we had in our last meeting that we will be. And then the other thing is, we did talk last time about a plans examiner. We talked about a couple of different strategies at council. I really would like to fund, we have it budgeted, and I would like to fund a plans examiner one if we can in this next year. I just think the priorities that the council has set and the things that we've already approved lead us into a funnel that we're just not going, we're not doing our any justice for those programs by not having a plans examiner to move those forward through the process. So if the council would agree, I would like to find a way to budget monies for that salary for a plans examiner.
Yeah, we, with everything that we have been advocating and advancing businesses and the economy, to a degree, you're correct. So we push everybody forward, but then it gets bottlenecked because then we won't go to the last step and hire somebody to relieve us. Because I know, I've talked to the construction folks and their lead times are getting long. So if we can't figure it out through the other cities, and I don't know where we stand on that, I don't disagree with you.
Duly noted. We'll figure it out.
Okay. So anything else?
I don't think so. And like I said, we'll look at that piece of it, especially in light of there's a few savings today that we found.
Any other comments from council regarding the budget?
Thank you.
All right, is there a motion to adjourn? All right, unless there's an objection, we are adjourned.